Mr. says the syntax of psychedelic time, fractals, endpoints, n times 0 points, something like that. What all this indicates is a set of ideas that I want to share with you that are a slightly different tack than my normal lectures. My normal lectures deal with the psychedelic experience as a generalized and historical phenomenon. But this effort at communication is slightly more personal in that it's an effort to impart one idea that came out of an involvement with psychedelic substances. My idea, it is idiosyncratic. It is a psychedelic idea, certainly, but it's only one of an infinite possible set of such ideas. And the reason I spend time on it to communicate it to a group of people like this is because I think it can serve as an example of psychedelic ideas generally, how they're formed, how they operate, and what's so great about them. And perhaps with an element of ego, I think that this idea intrinsically has an elegance that makes it worth pursuing. But before I talk about that, I want to talk about fractals for a moment as they're understood in orthodox mathematics, because the idea of fractals will serve as a basis for much of what I'm going to talk about. Fractals are technically defined as curves with a dimension greater than 1 and less than 2, or surfaces with a dimension greater than 2 and less than 3, none of which need concern us. What's important to know about fractals is that they have the peculiar property of presenting the same appearance at all scales. An example of a fractal in nature or a fractal-like phenomenon would be a mountain range, which when you get up to it and examine small pieces of rock that are sloughing off the face of the cliff and hold one up against the light, you discover that the edge of the small fragment of rock and the edge of the mountain range are in fact the same thing. And at first, this doesn't appear startling because you say, well, the mountain is made of this stuff, this small boulder is made of this stuff, and it simply fractures the same way. But actually, a number of issues are being touched on in this phenomenon. First of all, when you begin analyzing nature, you discover that many forms of phenomena are fractal. Coastlines, islands, the way processes condense, the way solids condense out of liquids in cheese making, for example, or something like that. There are many kinds of processes where a single process is reflected and refracted at many levels of magnitude, so that the whole and its parts and many levels within the whole composed of its parts all have the same structure. Some fractals have been known for quite some time, since the late 19th century, but they were considered pathological curves because they had the property of infinite lengths in very short distances, because they adumbrate themselves so intricately that their length can be said to be infinite. In the same way, you can understand that very readily if you ask yourself, how long is the coast of California? Well, it depends on what we mean by this. Because the smaller the unit of measurement that you use, the more detail that will arise. And at some level, the unit of measurement is so small that it's smaller than the molecular interstices of that which composes California. And at that point, the length of the coastline becomes infinite. Okay, so you get the drift of what fractals are and how they've been treated by mathematicians, particularly one mathematician. You can't discuss fractals without giving all the credit there is to Bernard Mandelbrot, because if you don't give him all the credit there is, he'll ask you why not. So he has invented this branch of mathematics, he has perfected it, and he's given us marvelous books where you can see these curves. And I thought about making this a slideshow because the fractals are tremendously beautiful objects aesthetically. But I decided against that because I want to hold to ideas. This is a think-along lecture, by the way, and you're free to think along at any point that you feel so moved to do so. Okay, so that's what fractals are for orthodox mathematics. The psychedelic part, and what I did with this, was I began to think about time. I've always had this idea that our physics has failed us because it is not true to experience. And every advance in physics has been gained at the expense of moving the terms of physics further and further away from anything that could be called concrete experience. So that what we finally have is an integrated set of complicated equations that we are told correctly map at the microphysical or the cosmological level the objects of nature that we're interested in, but it does not come tangential to our experience. I'm sure you've heard me say this before. So I meditated on time with the idea of fractals in the background, and I noticed certain things which are obvious, except they have implication when the idea of fractals is linked to them. And they're trivial things, really. They're things like every day is rather like every other day. And every week is rather like every other week, and every year, and to some degree every century, and to some degree every millennium. But I noticed that as you raise the ante in these temporal scales, change did become apparent. But at the daily level, every day is very much like every other day. But every day also is obviously different. And it's in the differences that we have the feeling of advance into a future and a feeling of completion. So I took all these ideas, and in the Amazon, when we were investigating the beta-carboline drugs, which are used in combination with DMT, I, under the influence of these drugs, fell into a long, extended meditation about all these themes. In fact, it actually went on for years. In fact, it's still going on in some sense. It was a true boost. And I looked at the I Ching, which I was familiar with, but had never particularly been obsessed with. And I noticed something very interesting about it, which is the King Wen sequence, which is the oldest sequence of the hexagrams, a sequence which precedes any written commentary. When mapped for its first order of difference, and its first order of difference is nothing more than, as you pass from one hexagram to another, how many hexagrams change, how many lines change. So, for instance, as you go from hexagram 1 to 2, all lines change. So 6 is the value of that. 6 lines change. When you go from 2 to 3, there is another value. And I graphed the I Ching this way for its first order of difference. Now, in a random distribution, you would expect a fairly even distribution of breaks of orders 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. But I found immediately that there were no 5s whatsoever, no breaks of order 5, and that there had been an obvious effort to optimize breaks of value 2 and 4. So that in itself, I mean, obviously it's ordered some way, so this wouldn't be too startling to discover a property like that. And I should pause for a moment and point out, for people who have interest in the I Ching, that the I Ching is actually formed of 32 pairs. If you've ever looked at it, it's formed of pairs such that the second term in each pair is the inverse of the first term. Except there are 8 cases, naturally, where inverting a hexagram has no effect on it. The obvious case is where you invert the first one. It's all solid lines, so inverting it has no effect. In those 8 cases, the rule is all lines change. And you see following the first hexagram, which is all solid lines, is the second hexagram, which is all broken lines. So in studying the sequence of the I Ching, your problem is not really how are these 64 hexagrams arranged. The question is, how are these 32 pairs of hexagrams arranged? So I graphed the first order of difference, as I mentioned, and then I noticed a peculiar visual symmetry in my graph, which was, it looked basically like a random squiggle, except that the beginning and the end of the wave were stereoisometric reflections of each other. Now what that means is that if you were to rotate in the plane an image of this wave without lifting it off the paper, you could bring the two graphs together and they would dovetail together perfectly at the beginning and at the end, but nowhere in between. And this seemed to me a very powerful argument for order, that I had in fact discovered a previous kind of order that was implicit in this thing. Now, to some audiences, I have to make a complicated apologia about logos and voices in the head and all that. I'll just skip that and say, and so I continued working with this thing under the instruction of the voices in my head. And the first thing that I noticed when the wave was fitted together in this particular way was that the hexagrams paired up so that they always summed to 64. In other words, 63 would pair with 1, 62 with 2, 61 with 3, 60 with 4, and so on. So it was as though a kind of magic square was being generated where the I Ching was additive to itself in all directions on a grid. And so I took this forward and backward running 64-term glyph or graph, and I said, aha, it is the complete I Ching running forward and backward against itself. Since it is the complete I Ching, all 64 hexagrams, all 384 lines, I will follow the principle of constructing modular hierarchies. I will collapse it to the simplest term in a system of levels, and I will treat this rather complicated looking thing as though it were a line, one of only 384. And then then from there, over a period of years and many pencil sharpenings, we went to computers and produced very complicated versions of this graph. And then found a way to mathematically quantify it so that it could be, instead of a network of lines running forward and backward against each other, it became a single line running in one direction into the future. Okay, so now what's so great about this? In its own terms, it is a self-consistent idea about time that tries to be true to experience. It's saying that time is made of elements. It is not simply an event space, something required for things to have duration. You see, before Einstein, space was thought of as the place where you put things, the necessary adumbration of a thing having being was that it be in space. Einstein came along and said, no, time can be thought of as a surface, as a continuum, as something which in and of itself can affect the outcome of the propagation of a beam of light or an electromagnetic field or something like that. What this idea suggests is something similar about time, that time is made of elements, and that what we intuit about time is more true to the facts of the matter than what physicists are telling us about time. What we intuit about time and what astrology and all forms of prophecy and intuition and clairvoyance and all these things are the idea that we can know about time by deploying our feelings into it. And what this theory does is take what has generally been a very feeling-toned, intuitional kind of idea and mathematicize it and give it rigor and say that with a very simple computer we can predict novelty. We can understand, first of all, that what is happening in the world of becoming, the world that we all experience as beings, is that novelty is entering into being, and it is changing the modalities of the real world toward greater and greater levels of integration. And no matter on what time scale you view the universe, you see this happening. In other words, the universe in its early moments is all chaos. There are temperatures are too high to allow even interatomic bonding. So there's only a plasma of stripped particles, charged particles. And then as the universe cools, atomic bonds become possible, and atomic systems come into being, which indicate a more refined level of organization. And then later, much later, molecular systems and on another level, stellar dust and star systems and organization of large aggregates of matter. Then life. And it represents another one of these quantum leaps in complexity, which is old stuff. But something else besides a leap in complexity is happening with each of these ingressions into novelty. What is happening is a speeding up of the speed at which these ingressions are happening, so that the first half of the history of the universe, you can say virtually nothing happened. Everything happened in the last half of the universe, of the life of the universe. And about a billion or 2 or 3 billion years ago, about 20% of what we assume to be the total life of the universe ago, life appeared. And then the early mammalian line appeared 60 or 70 million years ago at the close of the dinosaurs. Then we get culture 25, 30, 50,000 years ago, and very shortly after that, mathematics, and very shortly after that, electronic circuitry. And there is this compression of events which from the point of view of the historian is the major thing that he sees when he looks at the history of the universe. But science has never mentioned this peculiar compression of events and densifying of complexity. Science takes the position that if that's happening, it's unimportant, and it probably isn't happening at all. And science goes to great lengths, though it admits evolution, to make sure that it arises out of non-teleological processes, and to make sure that it's always confined within the realm of biology, so that an orthodox evolutionist is very uncomfortable if you start speaking of stellar evolution or cultural evolution. I've heard these guys say, if there are no genes involved, you do not use the word evolution. See, they don't want to see it as a formative process touching the organic, the inorganic, the social, the psychological. I took very seriously this deepening ingression into novelty, and I said it is a physical quality of the continuum that we're existing in. It is not a loose and unconstrained tendency, but it is a predictable tendency, like charge, speed, momentum, that kind of thing. And I noticed something very interesting about the number 384, which, if you'll recall, is the number of lines in the complete set of the I Ching. The number 384 is 13 lunar cycles. There are 29.29, I believe, days in a lunar cycle, 13 of which gives you 383.89 days or something like that. So in other words, it's to within a fraction of a day, 384 days. So it suggested to me a calendar. And then I noticed that in hexagram 49, which is revolution, it specifically says the magician is a calendar maker. And then I used resonances of this 384-day solar year, resonances of 64. So, for instance, I would take the 384-day year and multiply it times 64. This gives you a period of time which is 67 years, 104.25 days. That is 6 minor sunspot cycles and 2 major sunspot cycles. Plus it also, in the invisible landscape, the other astronomical correlations are made clear. When you rise to the next level, when you take the 67-year cycle times 64, you get 4,306 years. This is very close to, half of a zodiacal age. In other words, the precession of the Earth on its nutational axis requires about 25,000 years. And that is what is spoken of when they talk of the Piscean age, the Aquarian age. They're talking about how through the slow procession of the equinox, it is moving from sign to sign. And it takes about 2,000 years for a sign to be transited. So 2 signs can be transited in exactly the cycle of time indicated. I've spent so much time laying this out because I've noticed in other lectures that I've given of this theory, what has come through to people is the notion that I have a prediction about the end of the world, that I predict an end time. And then there's always lots of questions about what is your eschatology? What kind of an end of the world do you foresee? But what I really am interested in is not the end of the world, but everything which precedes it. And that's what this wave is looking at. And by comparing the wave with the computer to various historical periods, defining the quality that the wave is describing as novelty, which is this form of connectedness, we have been able to get very good fit between certain historical periods and and the wave. And naturally, since the wave is a mathematical fixed entity, once you have a good fit to one historical period, if it's a very good fit, the wave will fit then all of history, so that you can say you've been using Periclean Greece as your benchmark date with a certain idea about how the wave must look in that period. So then you find a configuration that fits. You say, okay, that perfectly fulfills my intuition about how the wave should look for Periclean Greece. However, I have an equally strong intuition about how it should look for the French Revolution. So now let's scroll forward and see how it looks against the French Revolution. And as the intuition of the fit builds, you define the number of applicable cases where the wave seems to be working. And we have done this and settled on a date, which I discussed a little bit last time, which is November 12, 2012. And someone brought up that the Mayan calendar also predicts the end of the world, whatever that means. It simply means that your calendar spins off its axis and you have to reset your clock. Maybe. It may mean something else. Whitehead, who I'm a great follower of, had the idea of what he called epochs. And he pointed out that a constant, for instance, the speed of light, we'll say, which is a favorite constant, the speed of light has only been measured for about 80 years. And yet all of our physics hinges absolutely on the supposition that this is unchanging over the life of the universe, 20 billion years. And so what sample of 20 billion years have we looked at? We have sampled 80 years in one spot in the universe. And yet from that, our physics is extrapolated. Whitehead had the idea of what he called epochs, which were like bubbles in the universe of possible time. And within these bubbles, certain laws were operating. And they would operate consistently throughout the bubble. But when you passed beyond the bubble, you found a different set of physical laws operating. And very recently, this idea, I noticed, has been brought back with this inflationary nothing cosmology that's catching on, where the universe may have a false vacuum bottom and may be suspended in a much deeper, stronger, denser vacuum. But what this theory is suggesting is that there are not only epochs of very long duration, such as the epochs which were in force when temperature and pressure in the universe were such that molecular organization couldn't sustain itself, we'll say. There may be very short epochs where laws manifest that are normally hidden. For instance, the puzzle of human history is something like this. 1 million, 2 million years ago, there were only monkeys on this planet and a very advanced bipedal chimpanzee, perhaps. Now suddenly, there are atom smashers and video games, Barry Manilow, all these things. And this has happened with startling rapidity. And it well may be it is because mind is manifesting, the constraints on mind as a force in nature have been lifted over the last 10 to 15,000 years, and nature and mind is claiming these new levels of freedom. And what I see happening, and this is why these lectures always seem to gravitate toward the future, is we are living in a very pivotal time. The time that we inherit from science is a time to humble you, to dwarf you. It tells you that the sun will not fluctuate for another billion years, that species come and go, and that, in other words, that on the temporal scale that you don't matter, and that now doesn't matter. But when you look at the release of energy, the asymptotic speeding up of processes. We tend to be xenophobically oriented toward the human, so what we say is that human history is taking place. But if you were an extraterrestrial lying off in your flying saucer and looking down at Earth, you would not see species. This is a Linnaean European concept that aids in the cataloging of natural products. What you would see if you saw biology is you would see a gene swarm on the planet Earth using species as the reduction valve as it flows through time, but only generally. There are many other ways that genes are transferred through episomes and vegetative propagation and this kind of thing, which doesn't need to worry us. But process and information, which is what has been happening from the very beginning. The atomic system codes and releases more information than the plasma. The molecules have a similar relationship to the atomic systems, and so on, right up to the cultural systems. And now we have reached the point where the culture is cohering, and we are becoming too big for the planet. All the natural resources are running out. All the political institutions which normally control the monkey tribe are breaking down so that every man can know everything, which makes previous forms of social organization virtually impossible. All of these things are happening, and it is because there actually is closure into these shorter epochs. We can now, after almost 1,000 years, if not more, of moving man off the stage and saying, no, man is not the image of God. Man is not the beloved of the Creator. We are on a small planet around a small star off on the edge of the universe, and our fate, if we have one, rests in our own hands, if in anyone's. This may not be true in the sense that if we change our values and say that nature conserves complexity and strives for complexity, if that's true, then the human neocortex and human society are the most precious and advanced objects and organizational dynamics in the universe. Now, I want to talk briefly about something which happened in the past, possibly, hypothetically, and how it relates to this running into the short epochs where all time and culture and information seem to flow together in a kind of psychedelic eternity, an information stasis, a kind of standing wave hologram that is the now. I mean, I believe the poster says, Plato says, time is the moving image of eternity, because we talked about that last time. Julian Jaynes, who was a psychologist at Princeton, talked about what he called the origin of consciousness in the bicameral mind. And he said that in pre-Homeric times, what we experience as ego consciousness was experienced differently by people in those early societies. What we experience as ourselves, something which we completely dominate and somehow enfold in our bodies. This is the cultural metaphor that the self is inside the body. They experienced as outside the body and exterior from the ego and somehow independent of their own will, so that what we experience as the self and the ego, they experienced as a kind of disembodied God, or guiding voice, or inner spirit, or guardian angel. The important concept in all of this being that they experienced it as separate from themselves. And then Jaynes goes on to suggest that it was traders who were people who passed from one society to another for the purpose of exchanging goods, who were the first cynics, because they realized that everybody's gods in different places were saying different things. And they realized, therefore, that there was something funny about these gods, that they were, in fact, somehow rooted in human psychology rather than in theogony in some sense. And they became the world's first egotists, or the world's first individuated people, because they correctly identified a psychic function as arising from themselves, and they integrated it. And then he goes on, I don't want to spend too much time with this, but then he goes on to say that it was the spread of trade, the rise of money, all these things which broke down these dialogues between cultural wholes and their gods, and that when it broke down, that was what shattered that world of city civilizations that is the true ancient world. In other words, the world of Babylon, Ur, Sumer, Chaldea, the states which precede the Hellenic world, were shattered by the breakdown of this dialogue between the people and the god and kingship. He talks a lot about how the kings were associated with this voice in the head, so everyone thought the king was speaking to them when they were told to go pump water, herd the cows, shear the sheep, whatever they were told to do. Okay, I mention this because I think that something similar is happening in the present, and that unwittingly James may have provided a metaphor for understanding this. We talked a bit last time about the flying saucer and how it was a projection of a future state of mankind, a mobile psychic entity linked to the idea of the exteriorization of the soul and the interiorization of the body in electronic circuitry. I think that what we all experience as our culture, fashion, rock and roll, politics, music, media, all of these things which we experience as the clothing that we must put on in order to be able to talk to each other, this is a kind of God, or a kind of autonomous psychic function that has slipped out of our control, or which has arisen outside of our control as a legacy of this earlier process of integration in the Hellenistic period, so that phenomena like the nuclear freeze movement, or the rise of the term networking, or all of these integrative, holistic, feeling-toned, you could almost say liberal, or you could almost say that liberalism in its classic 19th century guise is the first faint sounding of this theme. This rising global humanism is in fact the rising into consciousness of a tribal god, similar to the kind of tribal god that functioned in these pre-Hellenic societies. And however, in the present cultural context, cultural evolution is happening so fast that it is not going to take a millennium to pass through, the first faint enunciation of the theme, the full-fledged exploration of the theme of cultural wholeness as exteriorized God or godlike mind, to the integration of it. And the psychedelics, I believe, are the key to moving from wearing culture like clothes to recognizing that culture is this intensifying reflection of an aspect of the self and integrating it into the self. And that's what all the hullabaloo is about, I think. And I think that this is happening. And if the date 2012 means anything, it means simply that we could take that as, we could make a statistical model of what's happening and say that on November 15th, 2012, a sufficient number of people will have integrated this state of global electronic selfhood that it will be irreversible. That up until a certain point, when any stochastic process begins to happen, or when any cascade begins to get going, up until it has a certain momentum, there is a possibility of many different bifurcations leading to different end states. But once a certain amount of energy is in the system, then you can say, it's going to go all the way. And I prefer to probabilitalize all of these predictions of the end of the world, and to think of them simply the way you think of a particle in the quantum mechanical model. When we assign a position to the particle, we understand that the particle isn't at that position, that point is merely the center of a cloud of probable positions, any one of which could be occupied. Nevertheless, outside of a certain short distance from that point, the probability of finding the particle drops off asymptotically. So it's a cloud of probability, and this date up after the first of the century is the center of a cloud of probability. Now, what kind of ethics decline from that kind of a position? It seems to me obvious that the first thing that's apparent from that is that you don't sit around waiting for the apocalypse. You understand that as soon as you push yourself over the brink, you've done the major piece of work that has to be done in your cosmos. From then on, you just sit around watching it happen. So it's an invitation. We're all very fortunate. It reminds me, and I probably mentioned this last time, I think about it fairly often, of the Irish prayer, "May you be alive at the end of the world." Probably we all have a very good shot at it, but I have no idea what the probabilities are for any one of us. I've spoken of this tonight more in its operational terms rather than in the gee whiz kind of terms, which I did last time, where I painted a picture of what it will be like to invoke this global electronic aspect of the self and to integrate it. But these ideas about collapsing time vectors, about history having an end, about, in fact, history being the shock wave of an event at the end of time, these are the ideas that religions handle fairly well. I mean, this is not religion so much, but theology. Religion tends to concern itself with public morality, but underpinning religion is theology. And it seems to always, at least in the West, meaning in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, and in all of the spectrum of cults that each one spawned, and continues to spawn, there is this wish to put an end to time, to close it off, to redeem us from the cycle of becoming. And I think that the reason these ideas are so persistent in the human psyche is because all of history can be seen in biological time as so brief that it is simply a prelude and an anticipation